Alright, so this presentation is called Miss Colebank's Teaching Timeline, and it's a look at the history of the American teacher and the power and influence of schools since the founding of the United States. Now done with my first few years of teaching math in public schools, it is easy to feel powerless in a system that sees me as a small part, and to feel disenfranchised by the politics and policy that seems to get in the way of genuinely improving students' lives. It is also commonplace for older colleagues to refer to other or older times before so and so was in charge, before No Child Left Behind, when they could just teach the students the content and didn't have to worry about all the other stuff. As an educator, I knew that I would be taking on not only a role as a math teacher, but also as a psychologist, confidant, nurse, officer, and other facets of the job that are now expected. I can have such profound impacts on student lives while simultaneously feeling powerless in teaching them content I fully understand. As others tell me times are different now, I ponder what my job and impact would have been if I had entered the profession at a different time in American history. If the system wasn't so large and bureaucratic, would I have felt more important, less tied down by policy and district initiatives? This presentation takes a brief historical look at the way the American school system has come to be and the ways that that system asserts power on society as a whole. I hope to look at this in a macro perspective, but also through the lens of a single teacher and the ways that one's calling to the profession can influence the lives of students. As you watch this presentation, keep these key questions in mind. How is the role of a modern day educator in school different from early schools? Do teachers have a larger influence on students now or in the past? What would my life in school have looked like if I was a teacher in the 1700s, 1800s, or 1900s? How has the power and influence of schools changed over the last 300 years? Had I felt compelled to be a teacher in colonial times, the largest obstacle in my way would have been my sex and my inability to speak Latin. As highlighted in a job posting from 1772, immediate hire was available for a sober, diligent schoolmaster capable of teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and the Latin tongue. For full time teachers, it was often only a stepping stone to becoming a lawyer or a pastor, but also it was common for tradespeople and farmers to serve as educators in the off seasons of their true professions. Education in this time was reserved for young boys, all white, and many did not get formal education but instead were trained as tradesmen. It might not be a surprise, but options for schooling for women and minorities were extremely limited. However, the first school for girls was in French New Orleans in 1727. That school, though, was an anomaly, and there were only a few throughout the 1700s. Also, at this time, the role of the teacher in a student's life was relatively small, and learning was often through memorization, not a lot of synthesis, which is obviously more of a modern day concept. By the early to mid 1800s, it would have been more possible for me to be a schoolmaster as men were being directed to more noble professions and better and more teachers were in demand. This was also a time where reform in schools started to occur, making what was called common schools and efforts from people such as Horace Mann, James Carter, Henry Barnard, and Catherine Beecher. While many teachers were only reteaching the general information they too had learned at common schools, it was clear that a more educated group should be teaching in the blossoming free education system. In contrast to today's schools, religion and, at this time, political thought was ingrained in the school structure. The young United States realized that schools could be used to create an educated citizenry to help stabilize the new democracy. In the mid 1800s, there was also a push for standardization in teacher qualification. This is when normal schools were created to help train teachers, now often many young women, to help increase the level of curriculum taught at common schools. However, these types of schools lost popularity as colleges and universities started teaching the art of teaching. Many women became teachers because they were willing to work for so little money, but this inadvertently gave women large access to ideas, chances to change their communities, and opportunities to network with other women, as often they would go to summer programs to increase their ability to teach. By the 1900s, free public education was quite common and had to deal with the influx of immigrants into this country. This is the time that schools asserted assimilative power over diverse individuals, coercing the students into abandoning their cultural heritages and their previous languages. This was especially common in large cities where there were many immigrants concentrated in small areas. While many women at this time were teachers, the administrative structures of schools were predominantly male, and often boards of education were composed of businessmen that would make changes and improvements with little to no input from teachers. Teachers often felt stifled at this time, and the goal of the system was like a factory, so highly regulated and efficient. The late 1900s and early 2000s brought about many of the educational issues that we are now more aware of. Segregation was in place until Brown versus Board of Education and had many impacts on the public education system, and the public at large was concerned with the publication of A Nation at Risk. Schools became further regulated as teacher certification was monitored more, and school years and days developed requirements by states. Additionally, a lot of research and ideas about how students learned and assessed were developed, especially since the 1970s and 80s. No Child Left Behind also left a great impact on the school system with the acknowledgement of the struggles in minority and poor school communities. Teachers continue to fight, currently, for higher pay and are also dealing with the influx of technology into the school day. As mentioned earlier, in modern day, there is a higher expectations for teachers to be a psychologist, confidant, nurse, officer, and other facets. This is a modern concept, but has definitely been developing slowly over the last 50 years. There's also greater expectation for schools to have social help, providing resources and different programs to help students and families. As I read the following quote, think of what year you would have expected this quote to be from. Then I will tell you who said it and when it was from. It was with that first class of students that I became aware that a teacher was subservient to a higher authority. I became increasingly aware of this subservience to an ever growing number of authorities with each succeeding year, until there is danger today of becoming aware of little else. This quote's actually from 1899 from a teacher in Boston named Marian Doherty. And I think it's really interesting because she already was dealing with a lot of the struggles that teachers feel even today. I went ahead and compiled a group of pictures of teachers from the centuries I'd been discussing. So I encourage you to think back and say, okay, what would I have been like if I was a teacher at that time period? And what effect, really, would I have had on my students' lives? As we have learned in other courses, the school system in America is large and resistant to quick change. However, taking this historical look, it is clear that it will evolve over time, and the influences on society and students continue to develop. I encourage you to think about the ways that teachers can fight for long term change and think about what schools should look like in 50 more years. How do schools help students more now than in the past? What ways have schools exerted power on students, particularly minority groups, and in what ways does that affect society as a whole? We are part of a large and complex system. By accepting this fact, we can maximize our effects in our classrooms, school, district, and beyond.